Hi, everybody. Welcome to, sadly, our last talk in our series, True Crime in Ancient Times at the Getty Villa Museum. We still have another day of programming, though, so look for what's happening tomorrow. My name is Shelby Brown, and I'm really happy to host this final talk in our series. The talks have all been about um, our collection in many ways. This one veers, but it still ties into our collection, as you will see. We're recording. The recordings of past talks are already starting to be posted online, so look for them on the webpage where you registered in the first place. And also, please pay attention to questions that may interest you that you can start to put in the Q&A panel as Carol begins to talk and as you think of mummy questions. I'd like to introduce Carol. She's an Egyptologist and a professor of Near Eastern Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at Berkeley. She has experience in many places excavating, and she has many, many interests, but she's with us today as an Egyptologist excavating in Egypt at El Hiba. And her current research focuses on many topics, but we are focusing on mummies because luckily for us, her site is loaded with them. So I'm going to have colleagues put more about her bio in the chat, but we will get started with the fun stuff. And so Carol, please take it away about mummies.
Okay, thank you, Shelby. And thank you all for joining me today in this talk called True Crimes Against Mummies, Mummies, Looting, and Murder at the Archaeological Site of El Hiba, Middle Egypt. But before we actually go to the site of El Hiba, I want to do some preliminary background information about crimes against mummies. Okay, there we go. Yeah, now I got it. So, crimes against mummies took place both in modern and in ancient times. And in antiquity, tombs and burials and mummies might be violated for a number of different reasons, ranging from fear of the dead, whether an individual person or the dead is sort of a collective horror, as it were, to probably the most common reason in antiquity, as even today, which was robbery. Crimes against individuals, such as murder or physical attacks or mutilation of the body and so forth, and these individuals who were later mummified also took place. And today, physical anthropologists who are studying bodies can sometimes uncover and identify such cases. And as an example, most spectacularly, a recent analysis has suggested that the pharaoh Ramses III was assassinated by having his throat slit. In this talk, however, we're going to concentrate on more modern crimes against mummies. These were perpetuated primarily by Europeans and Americans who turned mummies into commodities and merchandise. And we can identify three major periods of mummy abuse, each with its own characteristics. First, from about the 16th century to Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Second, from 1798, i.e., Napoleon, to the early 20th century. And finally, from the mid 20th century to the present. So, first, prior to the 15th century, there was little interest in bringing mummies into Europe. But beginning in the 16th century, mummies became a much sought after and valuable commodity, largely for, oddly enough, pharmacological use. And the buying and selling of mummies became such big business that the Ottoman authorities ruling in Egypt in the 16th century passed laws to try and control the mummy trade. These laws backfired, unfortunately, because they merely created a lucrative black market in mummies. Our second phase is a violent wave of Egyptomania and mummy madness that gripped Europe and America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this was stimulated by the publication of Napoleon's studies, which resulted from his invasion of Europe, by spectacular archaeological discoveries of the time, think King Tut, but of course there were others as well, and by the desire of the Egyptian authorities to modernize their country and to open it up to tourism. And in fact, tourism to Egypt, which had once been very spasmodic and even quite dangerous, now became highly prestigious and very fashionable. And at times, mummies could be found for sale on Egyptian streets. And there was a fierce competition among Europeans visiting Egypt to collect Egyptian relics, particularly mummies. And our last phase of mummy abuse, as it were, is the mid-20th century to the present time, when we find that Egyptology and archaeology had both matured, and mummies now were largely valued for their scientific and cultural insights that they were able to give us about ancient Egyptian society and culture, and even the people. Mummy and Egyptomania were much diminished, but they never entirely disappeared. And even during this period, a thriving black market in Egyptian antiquities developed, and this market is active even today. So we can identify 7 main purposes or abuses of mummies as commodities and merchandise. Mummies were sought for medicine, as curiosities, as paint, as souvenirs, as entertainment, as fertilizer, as locomotive fuel, and finally as paper. And we'll now look at these briefly individually, so we can see what kinds of somewhat bizarre uses mummies were used by European and Americans in modern and relatively modern times. The first 2 uses of mummies, as medicine and as curiosities, predominated in our earlier phase. The remainder predominated during our second era, and then we're going to deal with the third era when we look at the site of El-Hibba. Mumia, okay, or essentially mummy, and you can see 2 containers here, was one of the most common drugs in the apothecary shops of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Mumia was considered a potent medicine, and it could be purchased in several different forms, including powdered and chopped preparations. Some mummies were even boiled in the oil sold as a medical ointment. Mumia could be applied topically, i.e. you could rub it on your skin, or it was mixed into drinks for swallowing, and it was used to treat an extraordinary variety of medical complaints, which ranged from toothaches to dysentery. So great was the demand for mummies for medicine at this time that it even stimulated a trade in fake mummies in order to keep up with the demand. Clinical use for mummies as medicine declined substantially from the 18th century on, but even as late as 1924, a kilogram of mummy powder cost 12 gold marks. And even in 1973, a New York shop still offered witches' supplies that apparently included powdered mummy. And even as late as 1999, the head of corporate history for Merck Pharmaceuticals discovered a glass box in storage in Germany that contained, 2 mummified heads and assorted feet, and was labeled, quote, Mumia vera Egyptiaca. In other words, true Egyptian mummy. In the 16th century also, public spectacles were held in Europe, and mummies were exhibited as objects of curiosity. And at the same time, mummy pieces, heads, hands, feet, whatever, were much sought after as components of a gentleman's cabinet of curiosities. Mummy brown paint was manufactured from, guess what? You got it, ground up mummies. and was used by artists primarily from the 16th to the 19th centuries, after which its use diminished. It seems to have been a sort of a sheer black-brown wash. The paint's composition also seems to have varied greatly, and today's conservationists who are examining paint and trying to figure out what it's composed of have struggled to identify specific examples of its use. A common recipe seems to have been ground up mummy mixed with pitch and with myrrh. Mummy brown gained its greatest popularity in the mid 18th to 19th centuries and was especially popular among the pre-Raphaelites. But its use began to drop in the late 19th century when more and more artists learned exactly what it was made of. Evidently, people thought mummy was just a name that didn't mean anything. They didn't realize there were actually ground up mummies in it. But it was evidently manufactured until the mid 19th century, and two pigment shops noted they had mummy parts in storage as late as 1964 and 1980. By the 1830s, upper-class Egyptians were flooding into Egypt as a result of the popularization of Egyptomania and mummy mania from Napoleon's invasion and also from the spectacular discoveries in Egypt. And these upper-class Europeans competed with each other and also with the scientists and with the archaeologists and with diplomats and everybody else in Egypt to acquire souvenirs that they felt embodied the, quote, mysteries of the Orient. And mummies, of course, were highly prized as such souvenirs. And we even had one cleric making a comment that, quote, it would be hardly respectable on one's return from Egypt to present oneself in Europe without a mummy in one hand and a crocodile in the other. Souvenir mummies brought home were often displayed in drawing rooms or in studies, and occasionally even in bedrooms. Must have done wonders for Victorian sex life. But it didn't have to be whole mummies, because hands, feet, and heads were often exhibited around the house, many times in glass domes that were placed on mantelpieces for everyone to view. Mummies might also be displayed in business establishments to attract customers, or used as stage props in the theater, or even employed as fundraisers, such as Mass General's mummy that was sent on a fundraising campaign for the hospital in 1823 and is apparently still around, exhibited in the hospital. Mummy unwrappings or mummy unrolling parties seem to have begun in the late 18th century CE, our time, basically, and really took off in the early 19th century. These unrolling parties were a not uncommon feature in particular of 19th century British life, especially, although not exclusively, among the upper classes. If you can hear it chirping in the background, that is Fluffy, my rescue house sparrow. He is covered up. He is supposed to be quiet, but he is not doing what he's supposed to be doing. So I apologize if you can hear him accompanying my talk. Okay, so back to the mummy unrollings. So the unrolling parties were a not uncommon feature of 19th century British life, especially, although not exclusively, among the upper classes. And unwrapping events were held both at large venues, such as lecture halls and universities, and in private homes as, for example, after dinner entertainment. Often the mummy that was being unrolled came from the host's own collection. There were that many around. And some of the unrollings had serious scientific and educational components and actually were more of a lecture than a party. And this type of unrolling would have prestigious guests in attendance who might be doctors, archaeologists, museum staff, or members of the Society of Antiquaries. But in other instances, what had been called the gawk factor was really the primary draw. And for example, the general public could purchase tickets to dramatized unwrapping performances held in theaters. Any artifacts that were found in these unwrappings or unrollings were often given away as party favors. And sometimes the bandages could also be given away as party favors. Okay, moving on to our last three examples of mummy abuse. We know of at least one case in the late 19th century where cat mummies were purchased by an English company for fertilizer. This company bought some 180,000 cat mummies weighing 19 tons, which were then pulverized into fertilizer and spread on the fields of England. And our final two abuses that are on our list are a bit more controversial because some researchers insist they are essentially urban myths and never happened, while others maintain their veracity and insist that, yes, in fact, they did take place. The first of these is that in the 19th century, in Egypt, mummies were so common that they were used as locomotive fuel. And the second was that mummy wrappings were imported into the US in the early 19th century for use in making paper. Okay, let us now move to our third phase of mummy abuse, okay, which, as you'll remember, runs from about the mid-20th century to today, and which generally saw mummies treated with scientific respect. But as always, there were exceptions that resulted as the development of an ongoing black market in Egyptian antiquities took place. And we find, sadly, that crimes against mummies are still committed even today. And as an example of this, we are going to pay a quick visit to the archaeological site of El Hibba, where I have been working since 2000. Okay, oops, let me go back for a minute. So let's first do a quick orientation to the site. El Hibba is a classic tell or town mound, which consists of the remains of an ancient town. Essentially, it's a heap of garbage because people are very messy, and when they lived in a place, they threw things out and buildings were demolished and everything accumulated, and eventually you have this mound or tell. The site itself is located on the east bank of the Nile River. You can see a view here, standing on the tell, looking at the river. It is about a 3-hour drive south of Cairo. The site's protected by a large wall that is built of stamped mud bricks that enable us to date the founding of the town to the beginning of Egypt's Third Intermediate Period, or about 1070 BCE. The town had its own small limestone temple to Amun, the Theban god Amun, and it was surrounded by extensive cemeteries, which you can see here, along with some of the objects in the cemeteries, a stone sarcophagus, what's left, sadly, of a woman, of a nice wooden sarcophagus. And here's an overview of the site, satellite view of the site. And here's our connection to the Getty, because it was once thought that these two objects in the Getty Villa, a mummy and a mummy portrait, came from the site of El Hibba, but more recent research seems to suggest that in fact they came from the Fayum site of Hawara instead. Okay, so let's look at crimes against mummies at the site of El Hibba. We had a number of areas that produced mummies in various states of preservation, ranging from complete bodies, wrapped and well preserved, to just individual bones that had been taken out of the mummies and scattered around. Several of our excavation areas were actual burial locations, i.e. sort of cemeteries or burial spots, where mummies had been interred. And in all of these cases, some or all of the mummies had been previously disturbed or looted. And in fact, the site of El Hibba, although relatively well preserved as Egyptian sites go, had been previously excavated and had been previously looted from the 19th century and even before down to when we started our work. And in fact, we know from archaeological records that modern looting began in earnest at Hibba in the late 1800s. And we know from our own experience that it has continued mostly sporadically down to present times. Now, what were the looters looking for is a question that I'm often answered. And typically, what the looters are looking for are obviously objects, merchandise that they can sell on the antiquities market, including the mummy itself, whole or in part, the container of the mummy, its coffin or sarcophagus, any mummy wrappings such as linen cloth. Sometimes the wrapped mummy had pieces of cartonnage on top of it. Sometimes it might have a plaster face in part. Such as you can see here, we recovered this from sifting. If it had been intact on the mummy, it would have been an object for collection and sale. And there were also items that would placed within the wrappings that would be typically amulets, or in some cases, even the mummy's clothing itself. These are beautiful Coptic textiles, not in terribly good shape for the most part, but still exhibiting the embroidery that would fetch a nice price on the antiquities market. And these actually came from some of the mummies that we excavated. Okay, so two areas in particular at Hibba produced mummies, and you can see them on this 2004 satellite photo. One is NGLP, which is the white arrow to the left. And if you look at that closely, you can see there right next to the X, right below the X, there's a big round hole. Well, it looks like a small hole on the photograph, but it's actually a big round hole. That's NGLP, which is short for North Gate Looter's Pit. And the second spot in the tell, okay, with the arrow pointing upwards, is BC1 or Burial Cave 1. That one is inside the town walls. NGLP is outside the town walls. What first drew our attention to BC1 was finding a mummy. And in the right picture in front of our bone man or osteologist, Dr. Robert Yohe, you can see what's left of that mummy. When we first found it, it was a little more intact. And we promptly nicknamed him George. When Dr. Yohe examined George, however, he informed us that George was really Georgina. And sadly, we think the wild dogs actually were eating Georgina, and that was what was left. That could be considered another insult crime against mummies. When we excavated that burial cave itself, we found a whole bunch of already disturbed mummies, which you can see here inside the cave. And when we dragged them outside the cave to examine them, this is what we looked like. Right. And okay. At NGLP, we began by excavating the edges of that larger round looting pit, which you can see underneath the canopy here. And here is Dr. Yohe beginning the excavations. And the edges of this looting pit produced a number of intact or almost intact mummies, which Dr. Yohe is carefully studying. And here you can see our excavations. This is one of the mummies. It was actually quite a production in here. You get to wear these fun masks when you excavate the mummies. And in that general area, Here we have that round pit, that's NGLP, okay, which you can see with the NGLP arrow. Nearby, we found an area of stacked mummies and also a disturbed burial area, which makes us think that that entire brownish area that you can see around the arrows is in fact, or was in fact, a cemetery, evidently a Coptic cemetery based on both the pottery and the type of wrappings on the mummies. Okay, in that upper area, we found this Coptic mummy here. Okay, we excavated mainly because it was just below ground surface, and we wanted to protect it. And you can see it here. But to our surprise, when we removed it for safekeeping, we have a special mummy room in our storehouse where we place any mummies we excavated. We discovered the toe of another mummy lying directly beneath it. So evidently these mummies were stacked one on top of another. We don't know how many stacks there were. Sadly, we will never know because that entire area was really badly looted in 2011 and afterwards, which I will get to shortly. Also in that same general area, where the other arrow was located, we found a series of intact burials, including this, what we think is a mother and a child. You can see them carefully placed here. They are marked by this reeds that were tied together and created as a sort of a wall. There's another burial here. And these were carefully laid out. And we excavated it sort of to see what's there. And then we reburied it because we didn't want to disturb it any further. At the same time, however, in that area, you can see over here, this area was previously looted. And the remnants of what happened when, sadly, the mummies were looted is what's left of this guy here, who this is the lower part of the body. He's been unwrapped. He's been sort of unceremoniously torn apart and tossed aside. And this mummy even preserves what our bone man euphemistically calls the Franks and Beans, telling us that he was a male mummy. Sadly, after the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, there was a brief period of chaos when archaeological sites were not protected, and a number of sites, especially Hibba, were looted. The site kind of looked like Swiss cheese after they were through digging holes in it. And a particular focus of the looters was to find, obviously, things for sale, and that meant mummies and burials. And this is just a quick view of the looting. You can see the pictures here, head floating around, bones from a disturbed burial. This was what was left of that same area with the Coptic burials. And here we have what happens to the mummies when they're insulted, as it were. Bones, foot on one side, and just what's left, bones and mummy wrappings. And in one area, our guards had collected some mummies. This was in our 2017 season. And for safekeeping, they put them in this little hole. They showed us where they were. We took them out, okay, and transported them to our mummy room in our magazine for safekeeping. And if you notice, they are missing heads. And I have been told that apparently mummy heads are, even today, a hot item for purchase, and you can even find some on eBay. So while we can't prove it, we strongly suspect that our mummy heads are probably either still on the antiquities market or somewhere gone. And finally, we actually discovered an ancient murder. NGLP mummy number 7, which we also called Arsani, okay, was excavated by Dr. Yohe, our bone man, from Cal State Bakersfield. He's also an associate director of the project and our site osteologist. And here he is beginning the excavations. You can see this is that part of that large pit. Here it is hanging out. And Arsani was insulted, as it were, initially by having his feet lopped off as they hung out into that large looting pit. So we excavated him. Dr. Yohe took him into his lab and proceeded to do a post-mortem investigation. Here you can see what happened when Arsani was unwrapped. And you'll note, okay, right here, there's a huge bash. And it appears that the poor Arsani suffered from blunt force trauma and was killed basically by a bash on the head. And here we have the evidence of that. So that concludes our brief overview of crimes against mummies. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and for your attention.
Thank you, Carol, very much for illuminating your site and all this information about mummies. We have a bunch of questions. I think the one I'm going to start with is personal. Did you start to identify with a particular mummy by any chance, or did you keep your distance emotionally when you were dealing with these mummies?
Since I wasn't the one who was intimately involved with unwrapping the mummies, I would just, as the director, I would sort of wander around and look at everything, and I get to point and say, dig here or do this or do this. So I wasn't as closely involved in that. I don't think Dr. Yohe did. He's the one who was really involved with the mummies. And he seemed to be able to keep a more scientific approach, shall we say. But also, they're a little, I don't know, that one, well, we didn't unwrap a lot of them, actually. We unwrapped a few, but not that many. Most of them are still wrapped up. Most of the ones that we actually excavated are still wrapped up and sitting in our mummy room, where they're being very carefully preserved. So
can you talk about what the penalties today might be for looting of this sort? It's still going on.
No, it does go on. It's strictly illegal. There are penalties that actually even recently have been made even more severe. You can serve jail time. You can get fines, things like that. But unfortunately, because it's such a big country and there are so many sites, that even to the best of their ability, the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities can't really stop all looting. It's much improved. The sites all have site guards. They're protected. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority takes responsibility for them. But especially for sites in a remote area like Hibba, it's really hard to constantly monitor what's going on. And, looters slip in. They come in dark. They hide in various areas of the site, and it's really almost impossible to control completely. It's much reduced from it was from that one phase when we had that massive looting after the Egyptian Revolution. So now it's more of a trickle, but it's hard to get rid of completely, no matter how much people try. And the local taftishes do their best. The local taftishes and inspectorate. So it's just, it is an ongoing problem. And there is an antiquities market for this stuff. We think that a number of actually whole mummies were robbed out of Hibba in that major looting event. What happened to them, we don't know. They may be sitting in somebody's basement waiting to be gotten out of the country. Smaller items like heads and things like that are just easier to carry and easier to move. So they're probably already sold. But it's frustrating because we've lost a huge amount of information from the looting. And that's one of the worst problems with it, in addition to basically, crimes against what were once living people. We have lost an enormous amount of very important scientific information from the way these things were just, yanked out of context, and then disappeared mostly.
There are, I guess, there are a couple of questions that relate to the motivations for for looting. One of them relates to the fact that there's so many stories of pharaohs' burials and tombs being looted for obviously reasons of valuables. Are some of the El Hiva mummies potential sources of valuable burial gifts that looters are looking for, or are they more like sources of mummies to sell as mummies?
Yeah, sadly, the mummies from El Hiba mostly date from a time period when there are relatively few burial items included in the burials. Unfortunately, we don't think our looters actually know this, which is one of the reasons why they're so aggressively going after burials. The motivation for looting is profit, but the amount of profit really varies considerably because the area where the site's located is a particularly poor area of Egypt. And we might find villagers, wanting to, say, pick up some amulets or whatever that they sell for a very small amount of money because they're at the bottom of the food chain, as it were, just to feed their kids, or to get milk, milk for their children or things like that. As we move up the food chain, as it were, there are also what appear to be sort of highly organized gangs who go around and rob areas. And there was one at Hiba. In fact, we even knew who the guy who was the head of it because somebody even pointed out his house to us one year. He is since deceased. He was apparently killed in a shootout with the police. But the sort of pilfering still goes on. So in that case, the motivation is going to be a much larger amount of profit. And these people would probably also buy from, say, the villagers for just a minimal amount of money, whatever they had turned up. And then, of course, it goes further up the chain to the international antiquities market where big money is made. And that tends to be made by those at the last end of the looting chain. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yes. That's a sad answer overall, isn't it?
Yeah.
Back to actually being good to mummies, somebody asks about reburying mummies. How common is the reburial and how does that work? And then are they actually safe?
We made an effort to rebury our parts of mummies that had basically been torn apart by the looters. We, as best we could, would dig a hole in the site near they were found and put in the mummy parts and the bones and reburied them. As far as reburial of intact mummies, that's not terribly common that I know of, mainly because it's not good for the preservation of the mummy. They can be taken, once excavated, they can be taken care of and placed in climate controlled areas, and one thing is in another. If you bury it back again after it's been excavated, there's no guarantee it's going to stay there. And in fact, we reburied our mummies that we hadn't excavated. Okay, we sort of exposed what they looked like, took pictures, and then reburied them. And as it turned out, that entire area was looted badly and totally torn up. And there doesn't seem to be much of anything left. So that's always a problem when you're reburying things. So it's sometimes it's you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, because you do want to treat the things with respect, the mummies with respect, and you do want to preserve them as much as possible. And sometimes even your best efforts just don't work.
Right. We have a few questions about the status of people and whether these people were in some way lower status, or how many ancient Egyptians were actually mummified, and is there a clear hierarchy of types and containers and so on?
Yeah, that changes over time. Our particular mummies, the ones we were looking at, seem to be more probably lower class, probably laborers. There was a stack of backbones, okay, from a looted mummy that our bone people picked up, looked at, and went, "Ooh, ouch!" Because apparently whoever owned them had been doing manual labor and would have had very severe back problems. And it does seem that the mummies that we did examine did show evidence of manual labor and not a particularly elite lifestyle, shall we say. That said, we find mummies all the way from the top of society of the pharaohs all the way down to, our guys. But it varies from time period to time period. It started off in the earliest times with, actually, we have pre-dynastic middle class burials that show the origins of mummification, with the arms and the face being mummified. And then when we get to the Old Kingdom, they've just recently discovered mummification of the elite classes. And that would continue down. We have evidence from Herodotus that tells us about three types of mummification ranging in cost and effectiveness, with the most expensive obviously being done by those who were among the elite, and the least expensive by those who were not so elite. And that is our major source for mummification. Oddly, we don't have any Egyptian texts that give us details about how mummification was accomplished. We can document different changes in techniques of mummification through time based on the mummies themselves, which is done by anthropologists studying the methodology. So there is quite a range, but in general, and particularly our period, anybody who wanted to be mummified could, as long as they could afford the mummification process. And if you couldn't afford it, they just buried you in the sand, okay, typically wrapped in a mat with your mirror or maybe one other item or whatever. And often those bodies survived quite well too, because of the hot sands and the desiccation and the climate of Egypt.
Could you talk a little more about the animal mummies? The Getty has our Heraclides mummies buried with an ibis, and you mentioned cat
Oh, cool.
mummies. So could
Yeah,
you talk a little about that?
sure. Animal mummifications become fairly common in the first millennium, especially the middle of the first millennium. Animals were sacred to particular gods typically. This was not idolatry. The Egyptians didn't worship the animals. The animals were basically representatives of the god. And particularly in the first millennium, the mid first millennium, we find temples and priests raising particular animals. So, cats, for example, for the goddess Bastet, ibises for Thoth, hawks for Horus, and so forth. And they would be raised in the temple itself, and then pilgrims would come in and purchase one. It was almost a quid pro quo. I will present this mummy to you, the god, if you give me success in my business trip. There were also alligators, crocodiles, dedicated to Sobek. And they found an area where the crocodiles were bred and born. They found crocodile eggs and the whole thing in a temple in the Fayum. So the result was literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of mummies. A lot of these got destroyed in the 19th century, unfortunately. But there are still a whole lot more, and we have a number of animal burial sites, such as at North Saqqara, which has a variety of things from dogs to ibises to hawks and so forth, to other areas in the Fayum, where they're catacombs, where the bodies would be buried. Typically, they're put in jars or they're mummified. They're actually wrapped. They have very elaborate mummification wrappings, and then were placed in these huge burial vaults by the priests, and they were supposed to work their magic for whoever bought them. Um, so that was a big industry. It was a huge industry, and they cheated because we would X-ray sometimes these mummies, and we would find partial animals and sometimes no animal at all inside the mummy wrappings. So, like everything else in antiquity and modern times, it was subject to corruption sometimes, unfortunately.
That's disturbing, but it's true. People are people all the time. There are some questions, some sort of tough questions about Western consumption of antiquity and of Egyptian objects, and they sort of overlap. But
Yeah.
I'll just feed you a couple of them. One
Okay.
is related to whether the use of Egyptian remains for Western consumption is simply Orientalism, though that you were describing in the beginning, especially.
Yeah. Well, a lot of today, when we're not leaving aside the illegal antiquities market, which is illegal, when Westerners work in Egypt doing archaeological research or anything like that, we do this under the direct supervision and with the cooperation of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. We don't take anything out of the country, everything stays in Egypt. Often we don't even take it off the site unless the Egyptians want to move it into a museum. So it's a much different climate now than it was earlier on. And it's very clear that the origins of Egyptology and the early excavations in Egypt were very much motivated by what today we call Orientalism and by colonialism, colonialist mentality, which was very clear in the early excavators. So yeah, I mean, that is definitely there. And that is something that Egyptology really has only recently, Western Egyptology has really only recently begun to grapple with. And it's in the last 20 years or so that there's now been a flood of books on the relationship between early Egyptology and colonialism, and so forth. So this is something that is being actively interrogated and examined in the current Egyptological community.
That's good.
Yeah.
Related is a question about it's sort of an act of crimes against mummies to do an autopsy or to examine an ancient body. And what is there resistance to continuing physical studies of mummies? Are there people who see that as a disturbance of ancestors? How is the attitude in Egypt of mummy work?
That is varies. The Egyptian attitude towards mummies and death in general is very different from the one we see among, say, Native Americans today. For them, a display of the mummy and with information about it and the person's name is actually remembering the name. Okay, which is one of the things the Egyptians wanted to do when they were buried. They wanted their name recited to live forever. And that was the whole purpose of it. So, from that aspect of it, we are actually doing what the ancient Egyptians wanted. I'm sorry, give me 1 minute to see if I can get this bird to shut up.
We have had, during the course of this True Crimes Week, visitation on the first talk by a cat named after a famous person.
We have a bird.
And on the last talk,
Sorry about that.
we have a bird.
Yep. Anyway, so the issue of sort of, dissecting or examining the mummies, I think, is a little more dicey, as it were. And it's sort of there's the bird. It's sort of a weighing of, what scientific value you would get out of learning about past populations, as opposed to violating individual mummies. And that's something that different people come down on in different ways. For the most part, the mummies that we have excavated and examined were endangered or already had been looted, and so forth. As an overall issue, it's problematic. Today, there's more emphasis on doing non-invasive examinations. You'll find mummies being put through CAT scanners, things like that. And that's really more of the type of investigation that's done today. We don't have to unwrap the mummies to get important physiological information. So an actual unrolling is really quite rare today, and usually takes place on a mummy that had already been fairly heavily violated. So you'll see in modern studies, what do they call them? CT scans and whatever, all the non-invasive techniques that can be used to give information about the mummy wrappings. You can clearly see all the amulets and things like that. So that's really the primary focus today. So you don't get the insults, and whether that itself is a crime against mummies is, again, arguable. But I think that on the whole, the Egyptians were concerned, as they put it, to live forever and to have themselves as an object of, I won't quite say veneration, it's not quite that, but respectful examination, let's say, would not necessarily have been against their worldview. And in fact, it's especially if you know the name, you're saying their name, you're memorializing them, you're bringing them to the attention of a modern audience. All of that is something that they would have really dearly loved, because they wanted to be known forever. So we're doing that.
Okay. And can you tell us why they're called mummies?
Mummies comes from the word, it's actually a Persian word, mumia, which means bitumen. And it became identified with mummies because it's actually happened early in classical times, with Pliny the Elder, and also later, the mummy wrappings looked like they had been made with pitch or bitumen because they were black. In fact, we now know that bitumen was not used for mummy wrappings until really quite late, sort of the mid-first millennium BCE, but that's what they looked like. And then it all sort of became mixed up, and mumia, as a reference to black pitch, then got transferred over to the black mummies. And that's where our term mummy comes from. It's, as I said, a Persian word, mumia. And that's what they called the medicine, the mummy medicine, when it was ground up and used for medicine. Same word.
So we're getting near the end of our time together. I'm going to ask you two more questions.
Okay.
And then we'll move along, and I apologize to people whose questions could not get answered. There's a couple of people interested in the mummies that you mentioned who were stacked, and what was that about, and how were they buried, and so on and so forth. Were pieces removed?
No, they're whole mummies. And what we think happened, assuming that we're dating the mummies correctly, what our bone man thinks happened is that a number of these mummies might have succumbed to the plague of Justinian, because one of the things that the looting has revealed is that bodies were buried all over on top of the tell. This was probably after the town was no longer used primarily, except for maybe a small section, as a town. And it was just a convenient place to bury a whole lot of people that had to be buried in a hurry. Now, we're not 100% sure, but what we have in that area seems to be a mass burial of a lot of bodies that needed to be buried in a hurry at more or less the same time. So that's why they would have been stacked one on top of another. And that was the same kind of thing we found in that round looting pit. And that may have been why they just sort of stuck to that one circular area and dug down. They just found one mummy on top of another, and they could pull out as many as they wanted, and then they got tired and went away, leaving some of them still there. So that's why we think, we don't know for sure yet, we're continuing to investigate this, but that's why we think that particular area had a whole lot of mummies in it. And if it wasn't the Justinian plague, then it was some other catastrophic type event that caused a lot of bodies to be created in a short period of time that then had to be processed.
Thank you. So I'm going to end with an archaeological question that is not uncommon for archaeologists to get, and you don't have to actually know the answer, but I'm really fascinated to hear how you will answer this. So it's a wonderful question about, can you make any estimate as to how much longer new Egyptian excavations will be able to go on before all that can be found has been found? There are other ways to phrase that, obviously. So react to that as you understand the question.
Yeah. And the answer is a very long time. There are discoveries still being made today, oddly enough, that actually change sometimes our fundamental way of looking at particular time periods or particular aspects of Egyptian society. There are towns that haven't been found. The ones that have been found still have a lot of area in it that could be excavated. There's an absolutely enormous amount of material in Egypt that's still there that has barely begun to be tapped. We know a lot about certain major sites like Thebes and Abydos and Memphis and so forth. But even there, in those areas, we still make new discoveries on a fairly regular basis. So there is a lot of stuff that's still out there. And also, should we ever run low on new areas, okay, which is possible, but at the moment I don't see that happening. We are constantly perfecting more detailed techniques for examining different aspects of different things, modes of analysis. We can now do, for example, isotopic analysis that tells us where people came from, if they moved from one area to another. There are different ways of analyzing what we find in houses that will tell us specifically what they ate if we don't have, say, bones or things like that. There are constantly new ways of examining things that give us new information that are happening all the time. So this will go on, or can go on, as long as the Egyptians permit it, or even by if the Egyptians take it over by themselves. There are lots and lots of things that can go on for a very, very, very long time.
So that's a great,
which is about as far as I can make
it. So through excavation or many, many other methods, knowledge about ancient Egypt through to today will continue to emerge for many centuries at a minimum. That's fabulous.
And still is. Yeah.
So thank you, Carol, so much. It was really interesting. We need to say hello to your bird, too, who joined you on your head.
Yes, thank you, Julie. I do apologize. Fluffy.
I really do appreciate your coming and illuminating mummies for us. And I ask everybody to come to the Getty Villa and see our mummy Heraclides and our mummy portraits. And please to continue to look at our online collection. Visit the True Crime in Ancient Times website, because talks and other things are being posted there for you to watch now that the week is almost over. And Carol, thank you. And everybody, thanks for joining us. And we'll see you all online or in person, we hope, sometime soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.